on firearms. But remember, firearms are a subset of impression evidence. So what's impression evidence? It's imprinting or pressing some sort of pattern or shape on another object that leaves behind some sort of image of the original object. This typically is going to happen when a harder object comes in contact with a softer object. So impression evidence includes a lot of different things. Class characteristics, again, big groupings, can include the model of a tool or the make of a tool. We could also see certain individual characteristics like unique wear marks of the tool. So one thing we may want to know is we want to determine how many people and objects were involved in a crime. We might want to know the movements of those people and objects, and we're going to want to create a timeline in a sequence of events that are going to support or refute the accounts of what occurred. So supporting it would be um, possibly trying to prove our hypothesis of how this crime occurred. Basically, what that's referred to is a reconstruction. So that's your theory of the crime. How did it happen? What were the events? And you're basically telling a story using the evidence. But you might also refute an account. And what's that mean? It might mean that the defense is trying to give you a different explanation for what happened. And then using the evidence, you can say that's not possible or that's not likely. Impression evidence can be two-dimensional. This is when a hard object comes in contact um, with a surface. So, for example, a tire mark on concrete. The concrete was harder, the tire was softer, and it left a skid mark. Three-dimensional would be an indentation on a surface, stepping in some mud and leaving behind your shoe print. Stepping in the snow. Snow is harder to capture, but it could be photographed, and there are techniques to actually preserve a print in snow. For two-dimensional, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. A positive image is considered when an object leaves something behind on a surface. So here, you can make your guess at what this is. You can probably tell, but we might look at ink being left behind, blood, oil, soil, actually moisture until it dries. Looking at this picture here, obviously, this is blood from a partial shoe print. And we talked about blood patterns, so this is being left behind. A negative indentation, or negative image rather, is when some covering material is removed from the surface through contact. So disturbing dust, for example, to leave a print. Blood that was on the floor, and then you walked through it, and so you disturbed that blood and left a mark in it. So after contact, the resulting pattern remains. Three-dimensional is sometimes referred to as plastic. And basically, when we're talking about that, we're probably referring to making a cast that inverts the image to form a positive of the original. So in this picture here, we see what they've done is they've poured a plaster that hardened into a shoe impression, took it out, and they now have a model of that shoe impression. So there's three basic types here to consider: visible, latent, and plastic. We use those same terms when we talked about fingerprints. Another term for visible was also patent, so you can see it. So talking about visible, easily observed without visual aids. Inked fingers, so literally fingerprints, could be a type of impression evidence here. Tracks in the mud, scratches on a door lock where somebody was trying to use a screwdriver or something to get into it. Biting a person and leaving the marks on the victim. And down here we see a bite mark that was left behind. So those are visible to the naked eye. Latent, not readily observable, but you can use a special technique to develop it or to see it. A lot of times this uses alternative light sources or special light sources. Certain chemicals could be used, certain powders. So for example, dusting for prints might be an example. of a latent image. And then plastic, again, um, something soft and moldable. Um, you're pouring a cast into it and getting a copy of this. So this is our impression in sand. We might want to make a mold of that. So basic steps for collecting your impression evidence. First, localize it. You want to sweep the area to collect all of the evidence. So right here, we can see that they're measuring from a fixed point. That was one of the things we did at the very beginning of the year when we talked about triangulating. Photography, okay, now we're going to take pictures of it. We did a whole unit on that. We're going to do an overall shot of the crime scene, mid-range shots to establish our locations. We're going to take up close-up shots. We're going to do it with and without a scale. So remember, we want to take a picture of it as it appeared uh, in the situation. And then we want to take a second picture of it with the scale there. Remember, from a defense point of view, if you only had this picture, what if there's a drop of blood underneath here and we're hiding it with this scale? The defense could argue that we're hiding the evidence, that that's the drop of blood from the actual perpetrator. And if you had tested that DNA, it would have helped to prove the innocence of their client. Now, that's probably not the case, but we want to not just take this picture with the scale, we want to do it with and without. Okay, so we talked about all that during photography. We're going to use different light sources from different angles that are going to help us get the best view of what we're looking at. We may use different chemicals that fluoresce or glow at different wavelengths of light. We talked about that this year. So different things might give off a fluorescence, such as drugs, body fluids, different minerals, different pigments. So we might spray these things with some sort of thing like luminol. And then with special lighting, we can see that, yeah, there was blood here. They tried to clean it up, but they left it behind. So here we don't even see the blood. And here we definitely see that there is blood there. But in the case of an impression, it might leave an image, and that we want to see. Okay, documentation, you got to write those written descriptions and sketches. You've got to give positions with a coordinate system of some sort, whether it's triangulated, GPS coordinates. There's many different ways. We talked about that this year. And then you're going to want to make a permanent reproduction if possible. So you might want to lift those prints and keep them besides photographing them. You might want to make a cast of it. So you're going to document this in a coordinated way. And so entire teams are going to work on this. And then, of course, we have to consider chain of custody here. We want to know what our chain of evidence was. We need to log it, record who handled it, in a very consistent way. We can't break that chain and keep that evidence secure. So there's a lot that goes on into this. You don't just walk into a crime scene, see a footprint, take a picture and walk away, or take a mold and walk away. You still have to do all that documenting that was discussed at the beginning of the year. If the impressions are made, where might you find them? Definitely in sand, in mud, soil, possibly cement if it was wet at the time, even in snow. Okay, this is an example of snow and a special material that was used to be able to actually make a preserved permanent print from snow. And that obviously is a specialized technique. Lifting the print, lots of different ways we can do that. Sometimes they use electrically charged dust and particles that can adhere to a plate and then transfer it to a plastic sheet that we can preserve. If the image is wet, we can apply a dust first and lift that dust off. We did some of this earlier this year, with special lifting tapes that preserve it. Footprints are a definite source of impression evidence. So footwear is probably the most common type of crime scene impression. And in fact, you can even, in some cases, look inside the person's shoe. So after investigating the shoe itself, they could actually cut the shoe open and look at the actual footprint of the person, and they might be able to get some information from that. They're actually going to look for those friction ridges. We have fingerprints, we have palm prints, we also have footprints. This is going to give us some class characteristics so we can find out who what was the manufacturer of the shoe, what was the make and model of the shoe. Okay, that's going to tell us just the type of shoe we're looking for, the size of the shoe. Individual characteristics might be imperfections in the specific mold. Wear and damage are the big ones. Okay, a little tiny stone lodged in here, little pieces that have been worn off, a little chip. That's going to tell us some things, and we can often match that to a specific shoe, or at least say that it was consistent with it. We can often use this to estimate the height of a person by measuring the distance between successive footprints and knowing the relationship between their stride length, just using some statistics here and some data that we have. You might be able to determine the order that the prints were laid down. Did they walk forward and then walk back over them? Were they moving back and forth? Was there more than one person? Who was there first? Who was there second? So some of these things can be determined. Might be able to tell if the person was standing still for a while. How fast were they going? You're going to look at the depth of the heel and the depth of the toe. Usually, when somebody's running, there's a deeper indentation where the heel tends to strike the ground first and then rolling across the foot and into the ball of the foot or the toes in a particular way. Okay, so we can have different patterns of footprints, and you may know if these are two different people. Is this the same person going out and back? What happened here in terms of the speed? Did they stop? Did they skid to a stop? What happened? And we can actually look at these things and determine some of those characteristics. Okay, um, and again, they're measuring the distance between these and figuring out some different aspects that can be calculated. Tire tracks are awesome, also very common, um, and you'll find them very often in soil and sand, mud, obviously. You can even leave them on asphalt, but they've even been left on victims in a hit and run, where the person ran over the person and this tire impression was left on their skin. This is an example of a person who was run over, and we've overlaid this pattern, and they were to determine the tire prints matched the victim. You can determine the tire's design's manufacturer, make, model, and sometimes the year that was involved. Now, obviously, different tires can be used on different types of vehicles. They can be changed at different times. But as soon as those tires go on the vehicle, they start to wear and tear, and that starts to make them unique. And you might be fortunate enough to have 4 different tire marks from the 4 different wheels at the scene of a crime, assuming a truck or a car. And what if one of those tires was a replacement tire and was different? Now you've got one that's unique from the other 3. And if you find a car that matches those characteristics, you've got a little bit stronger evidence that that car was at the scene. Also, the side of the car tire has information. Might have the manufacturer or the model here. It's going to have some information about the size and other factors. These areas here are called the sidewalls. And so sometimes the sidewall is actually in the print if it was in something that left a very deep impression. So imagine that tire sitting in some deep mud. Maybe it actually left it in there. So if you poured the plaster in and you pulled it out, you might actually see that. Um, when you look at this, if the tire left a long enough track, you can use that to determine the circumference of the tire. In other words, maybe there's a unique mark here, and then there's a unique mark repeating down here, and you see that repeating pattern from that point to that other point farther down is going to tell you that that was one segment. Or maybe in this case, we have 3 unique segments that match so that this tire rolled out 3 times. And so when you see that, you can determine the entire circumference of the tire, and that'll then give you, through calculation, the radius of that tire and know something about its size. Can match a specific tire from wear and tear also. So unique marks are going to show up. Okay, so the patterns may not match exactly again because you might get some wear and tear or the impression wasn't perfect. But there are people who spend their entire lives studying this and they can tell you with some degree of certainty if it matches or does not match and how consistent that was. In some cases, the distance between the two of these can tell you something about the width of the axles, from front and back wheels, or between the two. That can tell you something about what's called the turning radius. How sharply can this thing turn if you crank the wheels all the way? By taking some measurements based on those tracks, also, that's then going to tell you something about the vehicle. Okay, tool marks we will pick up in another video.